The morning of September 15th, 1943. Naval Torpedo Station, Newport, Rhode Island. Chief Engineer Thomas Caldwell watched through reinforced glass as the test torpedo accelerated through the underwater channel. The instrument panel flickered, then stabilized. 46 knots. No visible wake. The weapon had been running for nearly 8 minutes, its silvery shape barely disturbing the water's surface. Around him, 3 Navy observers leaned forward, silent. One checked his stopwatch for the 4th time. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Then it happened. The torpedo's rudder responded to a programmed turn, carving a perfect arc through the test range at full speed. No compressed air bubble trail. No telltale phosphorescence. Just the faintest shimmer as 1,600 pounds of hydrogen peroxide and alcohol burned inside its engine, converting to pure oxygen and steam at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Caldwell allowed himself a small smile. After 14 years of failures, explosions, and abandoned programs, the United States Navy had finally mastered what the Germans had pioneered in secret, what every major naval power had tried and failed to replicate safely. A torpedo that ran silent, struck deep, and moved faster than anything else in the ocean. The mathematics of naval warfare were about to change forever, and very few people outside this room understood why. The weapon tracking through Newport's test channel represented the culmination of a technological obsession that had begun not with admirals or weapons designers, but with a single German engineer's realization in 1925 that the fundamental limitation of every torpedo, every submarine, every underwater weapon system in existence could be solved with one dangerously unstable chemical compound. The problem was oxygen, or more precisely, the lack of it underwater. A conventional steam torpedo of World War II carried its oxygen in massive, heavy tanks of compressed air. 2,800 pounds per square inch of pressure, requiring thick steel walls that ate into the weapon's size and weight budget, and compressed air was only 23% oxygen. The rest was nitrogen, useless for combustion, dead weight in every sense. This meant that for every pound of fuel a torpedo could burn, it needed more than 4 pounds of compressed air to provide the oxygen. The mathematics were brutal. A Mark 14 torpedo, the Navy's standard submarine weapon in 1942, carried 1,100 pounds of fuel and 185 pounds of compressed air in heavy steel flasks. That air provided enough oxygen to burn less than half the fuel. The torpedo's maximum range at high speed, 4,500 yards at 46 knots, was determined not by fuel capacity, but by oxygen starvation. The engine could have run twice as far if only there had been oxygen to burn the remaining fuel. Engineers had understood this limitation since Robert Whitehead invented the modern torpedo in 1866. For 70 years, designers had tried to work around the problem, make the air tanks bigger, compress the air to higher pressures, use pure oxygen instead of air. But each solution created new problems. Bigger tanks meant heavier torpedoes with less room for explosives. Higher pressures meant thicker tank walls and catastrophic failures when things went wrong. And pure oxygen, while theoretically perfect, proved horrifically dangerous in practice. The Japanese had chosen pure oxygen for their Type 93 long-lance torpedo, achieving unprecedented range and speed. But oxygen systems killed Japanese sailors with alarming regularity. The cruisers Chikuma and Tone both suffered catastrophic explosions from oxygen torpedoes during peacetime. The cruiser Mikuma's oxygen torpedo storage contributed to her destruction at Midway. Pure oxygen in combat conditions was a bomb waiting to happen. The British tried a different approach. Instead of pure oxygen, they enriched compressed air to 57% oxygen, roughly 2.5 times the normal concentration. This provided more oxygen for combustion without the extreme dangers of pure oxygen systems. It worked, but the improvement was incremental. A British torpedo might run 30% farther than an American one, but it still faced the fundamental constraint of carrying oxygen in bulky, heavy containers. Then came Hellmuth Walter. Born in Weddell, near Hamburg in 1900, Walter was a machinist-turned-engineer who found himself working at the Germania-Werft shipyard in Kiel in the early 1920s. He specialized in marine engines, particularly the diesel and electric systems that powered Germany's growing submarine force. And he became obsessed with their inefficiency. A submarine diesel engine needed air from the surface. When submerged, submarines ran on electric batteries, but batteries in 1925 were primitive, heavy, and provided barely enough power for slow underwater crawling. German U-boats of the Great War could manage perhaps 8 knots submerged for 1 hour before their batteries died. Then they had to surface, expose themselves to enemy attack, and run their diesels to recharge. The limitation wasn't the electric motors, it was the batteries, which had abysmal energy density. Walter reasoned that an engine powered by a fuel source already rich with oxygen would not require an external supply from the atmosphere or from tanks. This would have obvious advantages for powering submarines and torpedoes. But where could you find such a fuel? The solution, Walter realized, already existed. It was being manufactured in chemical plants across Germany for bleaching paper and textiles. Hydrogen peroxide. Most people know hydrogen peroxide as the mild 3% solution used to disinfect cuts. That weak mixture barely fizzes when it contacts blood or tissue. But concentrate hydrogen peroxide to 70, 80, or 90%, and it becomes something entirely different. A violently unstable liquid that contains more oxygen by weight than compressed air, doesn't require pressure tanks, and releases tremendous heat when it decomposes. The chemistry was elegant. Hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, is simply water with an extra oxygen atom. In the presence of a catalyst, silver permanganate, manganese dioxide, or even iron rust, hydrogen peroxide breaks down into ordinary water and pure oxygen gas. And because the oxygen atoms were bonded directly to hydrogen, instead of sitting freely as compressed gas, peroxide stored oxygen at normal pressure in a liquid form, 5 times denser than compressed air. The mathematics were staggering. 1 liter of 90% hydrogen peroxide, when decomposed, released 470 liters of pure oxygen gas. No heavy pressure tanks required. No bulky compression equipment needed. Just a catalyst chamber and the peroxide itself. And the decomposition was exothermic, meaning it released heat. Lots of heat. The oxygen and steam emerged from the catalyst at nearly 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, ready to burn fuel with no additional energy input required. Walter patented his hydrogen peroxide propulsion system in 1925. The core concept was simple. Spray hydrogen peroxide through a catalyst chamber. The peroxide instantly decomposes into superheated steam and oxygen. Inject fuel, alcohol, or gasoline into this mixture. The fuel ignites spontaneously in the oxygen-rich, high-temperature environment, producing even more heat and pressure. Channel this expanding gas mixture through a turbine or piston engine. The result was a power plant that could operate completely independent of atmospheric air, didn't require heavy pressure tanks, and generated substantially more power per pound than any existing system. On paper, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was terrifying. The problem with hydrogen peroxide wasn't that it didn't work. The problem was that it worked too well. Concentrated hydrogen peroxide is among the most reactive substances known to chemistry. It wants to decompose. It wants to release its oxygen and become ordinary water. And given the slightest excuse, a speck of rust, a trace of copper, contamination from skin oils, it will decompose explosively. Industrial chemists who manufactured hydrogen peroxide knew the dangers intimately. A tiny leak from a tank could, if it happened to drip onto metal containing trace copper or iron, ignite spontaneously. The liquid would decompose with a roar, producing a jet of superheated steam and oxygen that could slice through concrete. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Workers handling the substance wore full protective gear and worked behind blast shields. Storage facilities were built with blowout panels and emergency ventilation systems designed to handle catastrophic releases. and Walter wanted to put this chemical into torpedoes and submarines, into weapons that would be shaken by explosions, subjected to depth charges, exposed to seawater, contaminated with every metal and catalyst imaginable. The proposal seemed insane, but Walter had one advantage. He was an extraordinarily talented engineer with an ability to solve practical problems that looked impossible on paper. He started small. In 1933, working out of rented rooms in Kiel, Walter built his first hydrogen peroxide engine. It was a crude device, barely larger than a motorcycle engine, but it ran. The peroxide decomposed in the catalyst chamber without exploding. The fuel burned smoothly. The turbine spun without jamming. It produced 5 horsepower continuously, with no air supply, generating power from nothing but liquid chemicals and a catalyst. By 1934, Walter had attracted serious attention. Dr. Albert Piech, whose chemical company manufactured hydrogen peroxide, saw commercial potential in an engineer who actually wanted to use his product. Piech invested 400,000 Reichmarks. Hellmuth Walter Kommanditgesellschaft was born. Walter hired Emil Kruska, a colleague from Germania Werft, and established a proper testing facility alongside the Kiel Canal, minutes from open water in the Baltic. Walter courted influential contacts methodically. The most important was Kapitan Zur, see Karl Dönitz, commander of a U-boat training flotilla. Dönitz understood submarine limitations better than almost anyone in the German Navy. He had commanded U-boats in the Great War. He knew that slow underwater speed made submarines vulnerable and tactically limited. The idea of a U-boat that could run submerged at 25 or 30 knots, faster than most surface ships, fascinated him. In 1937, Dönitz secured a development contract. Walter would build a prototype submarine, not a full combat vessel, but a research craft to prove the hydrogen peroxide system could work at sea. Construction began in 1939 at Germania Werft, under conditions of extreme secrecy. A tall fence surrounded the slipway. Workers were forbidden to discuss the project outside the shipyard. Security personnel monitored access 24 hours a day. The vessel designated V-80 was fish-like, streamlined in ways that conventional submarines were not. No deck gun. No external fittings to create drag. An enclosed conning tower that retracted when submerged. The hull was built from high-grade steel, hand-welded with obsessive attention to quality. Every joint was radiographed, pressure-tested, inspected twice. Any flaw could prove fatal. At the heart of the V-80 sat Walter's propulsion system, 2,000 horsepower generated by hydrogen peroxide and fuel oil, driving a single propeller through a reduction gear, taken from a Junkers transport aircraft. The depth control system came from a torpedo. The vertical rudders used hydraulics, developed for the Luftwaffe. Walter was improvising, combining components from different fields, creating something that had never existed before. The V-80 was launched on April 14, 1940, spring in the Baltic. Choppy water, cold wind, and a sense of anticipation that Walter later described as suffocating. Everything depended on the next few hours. If the hydrogen peroxide system failed at sea, if there was an explosion or fire, the entire program would be cancelled. Dönitz's support would evaporate. Years of work would be wasted. Walter himself took the controls during the first test run. Engineer Heinz Ulrich accompanied him, along with a minimal crew. The V-80 submerged smoothly, disappearing beneath the grey Baltic waves. Walter throttled up. The turbine responded instantly, the propeller bit into the water, and the submarine accelerated. 10 knots, 15 knots, 20 knots. The hull vibrated but remained stable. Water rushed past the hydrophones in a continuous roar. 23 knots submerged, twice the underwater speed of any submarine in the world at that time. The Soviet Alpha-class nuclear submarines of the 1970s would eventually exceed 40 knots, but in 1940, 23 knots underwater was science fiction made real. The V-80 held that speed for over an hour. The hydrogen peroxide system ran smoothly, the turbine maintained power, and the submarine handled precisely at speeds that would have torn conventional U-boats apart. When Walter brought the V-80 back to the surface, The test was declared an overwhelming success. Dönitz was convinced. The Kriegsmarine began planning operational submarines using Walter propulsion, but success created new problems. The V-80 had demonstrated that the technology worked. Now it had to be scaled up, made reliable enough for combat, and produced in sufficient quantities to matter in a war that was rapidly approaching. The Germans designated their first combat-capable Walter submarine the Type 17. 4 boats were ordered. They displaced about 260 tons, small by submarine standards, but packed with two 2,500 horsepower turbines, driving a single propeller shaft. Maximum submerged speed, 26 knots. Designed to hunt Allied convoys at speeds that conventional submarines could only dream of achieving. But building operational Walter boats proved vastly more difficult than building the V-80 prototype. The hydrogen peroxide, stored in flexible plastic bags inside tanks along the hull, had to remain pure. Any contamination, any trace of metal or organic material, could trigger decomposition. The fuel injection systems had to meter alcohol and peroxide with perfect precision. Too much peroxide and the turbine overheated. Too little and combustion failed. The catalyst chambers had to be replaced regularly as the silver permanganate coating degraded. Production delays mounted. The chemical plants manufacturing high-concentration peroxide couldn't produce enough volume. The submarines themselves were complex, requiring skilled labor that Germany increasingly lacked as the war ground on. And there was fear, rational fear, about putting hydrogen peroxide to sea in combat. One torpedo hit, one depth charge near the peroxide tanks, and the resulting explosion could be catastrophic. Admiral Dönitz remained a believer. He later wrote that with a little courage and vision, Walter boats could have been in service 2 years earlier, and they certainly would have had enormous impact on the war. But the German naval hierarchy disagreed. They saw the Walter boats as too risky, too expensive, too dependent on uncertain chemical supply chains. Resources went instead to conventional U-boats and then to the Type 21, an improved conventional submarine that borrowed Walter's streamlined hull design but used massive battery capacity instead of hydrogen peroxide. By war's end, only 4 Type 17 Walter boats had been completed. 3 were launched but never commissioned for combat. U-1405, U-1406, and U-1407 sat in German ports when the Wehrmacht surrendered in May 1945. None ever fired a shot in anger. The revolutionary propulsion system that had achieved 26 knots submerged went to war exactly 0 times. But Walter's parallel development program for torpedoes followed a different trajectory. While submarines took years to build and required enormous infrastructure, torpedoes were smaller, simpler, and could be manufactured quickly once the design stabilized. Starting in 1939, Walter's firm produced several experimental torpedo types using hydrogen peroxide propulsion. The Steinbosch, 533 mm in diameter, 1,730 kilograms total weight, turbine producing 500 horsepower, speed 45 knots, range 8 kilometers, and critically, almost without a wake, almost invisible. Several hundred were built, not enough to matter strategically, but enough to prove the concept worked in combat conditions. German destroyers and U-boats tested them in the Baltic and North Sea. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and fast, faster than anything the Allies possessed. But they came too late. By the time production ramped up, Germany was losing the war, and even perfect torpedoes couldn't change that fundamental reality. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, knew about Walter's work long before the war ended. Intelligence reports mentioned high-speed submarines. Captured documents referenced peroxide propulsion. But solid technical details remained elusive until May 1945, when Allied technical intelligence teams swarmed through captured German facilities, seizing documents, interrogating engineers, and salvaging equipment before the Soviets could claim everything. One of the Type 17 submarines, U-1407, had been scuttled in Kiel harbour. The British raised it, pumped it out, and transported the entire submarine to England. It was commissioned into the Royal Navy as HMS Meteorite. British engineers swarmed over every detail, measuring, photographing, reverse engineering. Hellmuth Walter himself and several of his team were taken to Britain to work for the Royal Navy under what amounted to technical detention. The Americans took a different path. They studied captured documents, debriefed German engineers, and examined components, but they didn't attempt to copy Walter's work directly. Instead, they returned to their own hydrogen peroxide research program, which had been running in parallel since the 1920s, and accelerated it dramatically. The United States Navy's interest in chemical propulsion for torpedoes began in 1915 at Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company. Internal funding, minimal scale, exploratory work by engineers who understood the oxygen limitation problem. Navy funding followed in 1920, continuing until 1926 when the program was quietly shelved. The technology wasn't ready, the dangers were too great, and conventional torpedoes seemed good enough for the threats America faced. But in 1929, the Navy returned to chemical propulsion with a formal program at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. This wasn't about submarines or radical new weapons systems. This was about incrementally improving torpedo performance. Could hydrogen peroxide provide more range? Could it be handled safely? Could it be manufactured in quantity? The research proceeded slowly, methodically, without the urgency that war would later impose. By 1934, 5 years into the program, the Naval Research Laboratory had settled on Naval as their preferred solution. Naval was a proprietary mixture, 70% hydrogen peroxide dissolved in water, with chemical stabilizers added to reduce spontaneous decomposition, less concentrated than the German peroxide, which often reached 80 or 90%, but safer and more stable for shipboard storage. The virtues of Naval were clear on paper. It was a liquid, over 90% oxygen by weight compared to air's 23%. It had a specific volume per pound, about 1/5 that of 2800 psi compressed air. In the decomposition of the peroxide, 2H2O2 yields 2H2O plus O2, over 48% of the oxygen becomes available. Thus, about 34% of the oxygen in standard Naval was available for combustion. Naval would provide oxygen to burn about 50% more fuel than the same weight of air. And the decomposition was exothermic, meaning the heat produced was also useful for propulsion. 3 years were spent preparing a suitable power plant. Then, in September 1937, the Naval Research Laboratory conducted tank and range tests with a converted Mark 10 torpedo. The results stunned the engineers. The torpedo achieved a range almost 3 times that of a conventional Mark 10. With this success, a Mark 14 torpedo was converted. It achieved an almost 4-fold increase in range, from 4,500 yards at 46 knots to potential ranges exceeding 16,000 yards at the same speed. These results led to plans for production torpedoes designated Mark 16 for submarines and Mark 17 for destroyers. Both would use naval propulsion. Both would revolutionize American torpedo warfare. But then came December 7, 1941, and Pearl Harbor changed everything. The urgent need to produce standard torpedoes, especially the Mark 13 and Mark 14, overwhelmed the naval program. Every manufacturing facility focused on conventional weapons. Experimental programs were shelved. The Mark 16 and Mark 17 development froze. America was in a war it wasn't prepared to fight, using weapons that worked, mostly, and there was no time for innovation when the fleet needed thousands of conventional torpedoes immediately. There was no further progress until 1943. By then, the immediate crisis had passed. Production of Mark 14s and Mark 18s had stabilized. The torpedo scandal, depth-keeping failures, magnetic exploder problems, contact exploder issues, was being systematically resolved, and intelligence about the Japanese Type 93 Long Lance torpedo became solid enough to drive strategic decisions. The Long Lance ran on pure oxygen at 49 knots for 22 miles. It carried a warhead nearly double the size of American torpedoes. It was the most effective torpedo in the world, and the Japanese had been using it since 1933. American submariners and destroyer crews were fighting an enemy with vastly superior weapons, and the gap was killing American sailors. In 1943, the Naval Torpedo Station at Newport, Rhode Island, and the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington re-examined the naval program. They determined that the supply of naval was inadequate for production. Plans were made for a new manufacturing plant, but it was delayed and didn't finally start until the fall of 1944. Also, in 1943, the design of the submarine-launched Mark 16 naval torpedo began in earnest. The Mark 16 was designed to have the same physical dimensions as the Mark 14, allowing it to be fired from unmodified submarine torpedo tubes. 21 inches in diameter, 20 feet 6 inches long, weighing 2 tons when loaded. But inside that familiar envelope, everything was different. The propulsion system used naval and alcohol, decomposing the peroxide through a catalyst chamber, burning the alcohol in the resulting oxygen-steam mixture, and driving a turbine at power levels conventional torpedoes couldn't approach. The Mark 16 Mod 0 carried 1,260 pounds of Torpex explosive, the most powerful conventional submarine torpedo warhead in the world. Torpex was approximately 75% more powerful by weight than the explosive the Japanese used in the Long Lance. Despite carrying 210 kilograms less explosive than the late-war Long Lance Mod 3, the Mark 16's Torpex warhead was actually more destructive. Performance specifications were staggering. The Mod 0 could run 16,500 yards at 46 knots. The Mod 1, with a slightly smaller warhead of 960 pounds, could achieve 11,000 yards at 46.2 knots. Both variants could be set for straight running or pattern running, allowing tactical flexibility that earlier torpedoes lacked. The Mark 17 destroyer torpedo was essentially a larger Mark 16, designed for surface ship launch. Development had been halted in 1941, resumed in 1944, when the Long Lance threat became impossible to ignore. 450 Mark 17s were manufactured before the war ended. Like the Mark 16, none saw combat use. The weapons arrived too late. By the time naval torpedoes reached operational status in early 1945, the Pacific War was effectively won. American submarines dominated Japanese shipping lanes. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been crippled at Leyte Gulf. Remaining Japanese warships huddled in port, conserving fuel, avoiding battles they couldn't win. There was simply no tactical situation where deploying experimental naval torpedoes made sense when conventional Mark 14s and Mark 18s were working reliably. Several hundred each of Mark 16 and Mark 17 torpedoes were completed before the war ended in August 1945. But neither saw use in combat. The revolutionary weapons that could outperform the Japanese Long Lance, that represented 14 years of American research and millions of dollars in development, sat in storage magazines while conventional torpedoes finished the job. Yet, this was not the end of the hydrogen peroxide torpedo story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. Because while the Mark 16 never sank a Japanese warship, it would go on to become the United States Navy's standard anti-ship torpedo for 20 years. From 1945 to the mid-1960s, as the Cold War intensified and the Soviet submarine threat grew, the Mark 16 remained in service despite significant numbers of Mark 14 torpedoes left over from wartime production. The reason was simple. The Mark 16 was better, faster, longer-ranged, more powerful, and with capabilities that conventional steam torpedoes couldn't match. After World War II, the Mod 0 and Mod 1 variants were developed into a common torpedo, designated Mark 16, Mod 8. This version kept the longer range of the Mod 1 and the larger warhead of the Mod 0, incorporating 1,260 pounds of HBX explosive, even more powerful than the original Torpex, in place of the earlier warhead. The Mark 16 Mod 8 specifications represented the peak of American non-homing torpedo development. Range of 13,700 yards at 46 knots, nearly silent running due to the closed-cycle combustion system, devastating warhead capable of breaking a cruiser's keel. and pattern-running capability that allowed the torpedo to execute programmed maneuvers, covering a search area rather than simply running straight. These were formidable weapons. They equipped American submarines throughout the late 1940s, the entire 1950s, and well into the 1960s. Submariners learned to handle Naval with appropriate respect. The torpedoes were loaded, carefully, monitored constantly for signs of decomposition, and stored in temperature-controlled magazines. Procedures were strict. Safety equipment was mandatory. And despite these precautions, the dangers remained. Hydrogen peroxide had not become safer merely because engineers understood it better. The fundamental chemistry remained unchanged. Concentrate hydrogen peroxide wants to decompose. It wants to become water and oxygen and heat. Any contamination, any catalyst, any loss of stabilizer, concentration, and decomposition begins. If that decomposition occurs inside a confined space, inside a torpedo tube or a storage magazine, the results are catastrophic. The British learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. HMS Sidon, a submarine of the Royal Navy, was moored in Portland Harbour on June 16, 1955. The submarine carried experimental torpedoes using hydrogen peroxide propulsion, similar in principle to the German Walter torpedoes and the American Mark 16. Something went wrong. Accounts vary on the specific trigger: a leak, a contamination, a maintenance error. But hydrogen peroxide began decomposing inside a torpedo. The decomposition accelerated. Steam and oxygen filled the torpedo compartment, pressure built, metal began to glow red-hot from the released heat. Sailors tried to control the situation, tried to vent the compartment, tried to flood it with seawater. Nothing worked. The hydrogen peroxide continued decomposing, generating more heat, more pressure, more oxygen to feed the growing inferno. The explosion, when it came, was not nuclear in scale, but it was devastating. 13 men were killed instantly. 7 others were seriously injured. The submarine's forward section was torn apart. Portland Harbour filled with smoke and steam. Rescue crews pulled survivors from the water, while fires raged inside what remained of HMS Sidon. The submarine was eventually raised, examined, and scrapped. Too damaged to repair. Too dangerous to restore. The British government immediately halted all work on hydrogen peroxide torpedoes for submarine use. The risk was deemed unacceptable. But interestingly, the Royal Navy continued using hydrogen peroxide in air-dropped torpedoes through 1989. The Mark 38 torpedo used Otto fuel, a mixture of hydrogen peroxide and kerosene, right up until the end of the Cold War. The logic was simple. If an aircraft-launched torpedo malfunctioned, it exploded in the ocean, not inside a submarine full of sailors. The risk calculation changed entirely. The Soviets, meanwhile, pressed ahead with hydrogen peroxide torpedoes despite knowing about the Sidon disaster. Russian engineers developed a family of high-test peroxide weapons, designating them with strictly functional names. The 53 to 57 torpedo, where 53 referred to the diameter in centimeters and 57 to the year of introduction, ran on concentrated hydrogen peroxide. It was fast, powerful, and dangerous to friend and foe alike. Soviet submariners handled these weapons with paranoid caution, monitoring decomposition rates constantly, checking for contamination, maintaining temperature control systems religiously. But no amount of caution could completely eliminate the danger. On August 12, 2000, the Russian submarine Kursk was conducting exercises in the Barents Sea. She was an Oscar II-class guided missile submarine, one of the most powerful warships in the Russian Navy, carrying 24 anti-ship cruise missiles and a full complement of torpedoes, including hydrogen peroxide weapons. An explosion tore through the forward torpedo compartment. The cause was never definitively established because the submarine sank with all hands, 118 men, taking her secrets to the ocean floor. But the most credible explanation, supported by analysis of recovered wreckage, points to a hydrogen peroxide torpedo, a leak, decomposition beginning, inside the weapon. Heat building, the torpedo's fuel or explosive igniting, and then catastrophic detonation of multiple weapons in the confined space of the torpedo room. The first explosion was bad. The second explosion, 115 seconds later, as other torpedoes and their warheads detonated, was apocalyptic. Seismic monitoring stations across northern Europe recorded it as a magnitude 4.2 earthquake. The Kursk's bow was blown completely off. The submarine plunged to the bottom. Rescue attempts failed. When salvage teams finally raised sections of the hull years later, the torpedo compartment was unrecognizable. Twisted metal, blast patterns, evidence of temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees. The Kursk disaster marked the effective end of hydrogen peroxide torpedoes in military service. Russia quietly withdrew remaining peroxide weapons from active submarines. Other navies, already skeptical, abandoned development programs. The Swedish Navy, which had produced hydrogen peroxide torpedoes longer than any other nation, phased out their last peroxide weapons by the early 2000s. The era of hydrogen peroxide propulsion, which had begun with such promise in 1925, effectively ended 75 years later in tragedy. Yet the technology's influence extends far beyond torpedoes. Hydrogen peroxide propulsion helped establish the fundamental principles of air-independent power systems that modern submarines still use. The German Type 17 submarines and American Mark 16 torpedoes proved that closed-cycle combustion could work underwater. They demonstrated that submarines didn't need to surface for air. They showed that energy density mattered more than raw power when operating in confined spaces with limited fuel storage. Modern air-independent propulsion systems, used by diesel-electric submarines from Germany, Sweden, France, Japan, and other nations, employ different chemistry. They use liquid oxygen, fuel cells, or Stirling engines instead of hydrogen peroxide. But the underlying concept, that a submarine can generate power without atmospheric air by carrying its oxygen source on board, traces directly back to Hellmuth Walter's work in the 1920s and 30s. The aerospace industry learned even more from hydrogen peroxide. Walter's work on rocket engines for the Messerschmitt Me 163 Interceptor using hydrogen peroxide as an oxidizer with Seestoff fuel pioneered techniques that appeared in American, British, and Soviet rocket programs after the war. The X-15 research aircraft used hydrogen peroxide for its reaction control thrusters. The Bell rocket belt employed concentrated peroxide. The British Black Arrow launch vehicle used hydrogen peroxide and kerosene to launch satellites from Australia in the 1970s. Even today, the Russian Soyuz spacecraft uses 82% hydrogen peroxide to drive the turbopumps on its rocket engines. The same chemistry that powered the V-80 submarine in 1940 and the Mark 16 torpedo in 1945 continues to lift cosmonauts into orbit in 2025. The specific application changed. The fundamental principles remained. But for torpedoes, hydrogen peroxide proved to be a technological dead end. The weapon was simply too dangerous for the incremental advantages it provided. Yes, it ran faster than steam torpedoes. Yes, it had longer range. Yes, it produced minimal wake. But these advantages didn't justify the risks of catastrophic decomposition, especially as alternative technologies emerged. Electric torpedoes, using battery power, were slower but completely safe. Nuclear-powered submarines eliminated the need for ultra-long-range torpedoes because the submarines themselves could position closer to targets. Wire-guided and then acoustic homing torpedoes made speed less critical because the weapon could adjust course to follow evasive targets. And eventually, modern Otto-fuel torpedoes provided similar performance to hydrogen peroxide systems without the catastrophic failure modes. The Mark 16 was withdrawn from United States Navy service in 1972. By 1975, the last examples had been replaced completely by the Mark 48 torpedo, which used Otto fuel and offered wire guidance, active sonar homing, and dual-purpose capability against both surface ships and submarines. The Mark 48 couldn't match the Mark 16's top speed, but it didn't need to. It was smarter, more reliable, and dramatically safer. Looking back at that morning in September 1943, when Thomas Caldwell watched the test torpedo carve through the water at Newport at 46 silent knots, the achievement seems both remarkable and tragic. Remarkable because American engineers had mastered one of the most difficult propulsion challenges in naval history. They had taken a concept pioneered by Germans, studied it independently for 14 years, and produced a weapon that exceeded the performance of anything else in the world. Tragic because that weapon, for all its technical brilliance, was fundamentally flawed. Not in its performance. The Mark 16 worked as designed. It ran fast, hit hard, and survived in service for 30 years. But it demanded constant vigilance, perfect maintenance, and acceptance of risks that eventually proved unacceptable. HMS Sidon and the Kursk demonstrated that hydrogen peroxide in combat systems was not a question of if disaster would strike, but when. The irony is profound. Hellmuth Walter set out to solve the oxygen problem, to free torpedoes and submarines from the tyranny of compressed air and atmospheric breathing. He succeeded brilliantly. His propulsion system worked, but in solving one problem, he created another that proved equally intractable. Hydrogen peroxide was too reactive, too unstable, too dangerous for routine military use. The cure was nearly as bad as the disease. Engineers sometimes joke that there are old pilots and bold pilots, but no old, bold pilots. The same principle applies to chemical propulsion systems. There are safe systems and powerful systems, but rarely systems that are both. Hydrogen peroxide was powerful. It delivered performance that conventional torpedoes couldn't approach, but it was never truly safe, not in the way that naval weapons need to be safe when sailors' lives depend on them functioning predictably under combat stress. The Mark 16 torpedo represents a fascinating moment in weapons development, a period when raw performance sometimes trumped safety concerns, when engineers pushed boundaries without fully understanding the long-term consequences, when desperation to match enemy capabilities led to accepting risks that peacetime would never tolerate. World War II forced such decisions constantly. Build weapons that work now, even if they're dangerous. Worry about perfecting them later, if we survive. America survived. The Mark 16 survived with it, transitioning from wartime experiment to Cold War standard. For 2 decades, submarine crews loaded naval torpedoes into tubes, monitoring decomposition rates, following procedures designed to prevent exactly the kind of disasters that eventually claimed HMS Sidon and the Kursk. They were lucky. Or perhaps more accurately, they were careful. American safety protocols, developed through years of experience with the temperamental weapons, proved robust enough to prevent catastrophe. But the underlying reality never changed. Every Mark 16 carried the potential for disaster. Every naval torpedo was a controlled explosion waiting for any excuse to become uncontrolled. Submariners who served with these weapons understood this implicitly. They respected the torpedoes in ways that went beyond normal military discipline. They knew they were handling something genuinely dangerous, not just to the enemy, but to themselves. When the Navy finally retired the Mark 16 in 1975, replacing it with modern Otto fuel weapons, there must have been relief alongside the usual nostalgia for old equipment. Relief that they no longer had to worry about hydrogen peroxide decomposition. Relief that the next generation of torpedoes, while perhaps less glamorous in their specifications, wouldn't explode in the storage magazine if someone made a maintenance error. The Chemist's insane explosive mix that made torpedoes run silent at 46 knots turned out to be exactly that. Insane, not impossible, not impractical. The Mark 16 proved the concept worked. But insane in the sense that it demanded perfection from imperfect systems operated by fallible humans in the chaos of military operations. And military history teaches that perfection is impossible to maintain indefinitely. Eventually, something goes wrong. Eventually, the weakest link breaks. For the Kursk, it came in 2000. For American submarines carrying Mark 16s, it somehow never came. Not because the weapons were safer. American naval torpedoes used the same chemistry, faced the same risks. But because procedures were followed, Maintenance was performed correctly, and perhaps because fortune smiled on those who needed it most. The hydrogen peroxide torpedo stands as a reminder that technological capability and operational wisdom are not the same thing. Engineers can build weapons that push physics to the limit. They can create systems that achieve remarkable performance through clever chemistry and precision engineering. But whether those weapons should be built, whether the performance gains justify the operational risks, those are different questions that require different kinds of wisdom. Hellmuth Walter never doubted the value of his creation. He spent decades refining hydrogen peroxide, propulsion, working for the Germans, the British, the Americans, always believing that the next generation of systems would solve the safety problems that plagued earlier versions. He died in 1980, the same year the Soviet Union was secretly expanding production of hydrogen peroxide torpedoes that would eventually sink the Kursk. The engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory and Naval Torpedo Station, who developed the Mark 16, were less certain. They understood they were building dangerous weapons. The safety procedures, the monitoring systems, the strict handling protocols, all reflected awareness that naval demanded respect. They gave the Navy a weapon that exceeded German performance using American-developed technology. Whether that weapon was wise, whether hydrogen peroxide torpedoes represented sound military investment, the Navy answered that question in 1975 by retiring them. Today, no Navy operates hydrogen peroxide torpedoes. The technology that once seemed revolutionary, that promised to transform underwater warfare, exists only in museums and technical histories. A few Mark 16 torpedoes survive in naval collections, their naval tanks drained and purged decades ago, their propulsion systems rendered permanently inert. They are artifacts of an era when performance mattered more than safety, when engineers solved problems without fully considering long-term consequences, when desperation drove innovation in directions that peacetime logic would reject. The torpedo that ran silent at 46 knots, that could reach targets 11,000 yards away before those targets knew they were under attack, that carried the most powerful non-nuclear warhead ever fitted to an American torpedo, served honorably for 30 years, and then vanished into history. Not because it failed, because it succeeded too well at being exactly what Hellmuth Walter envisioned in 1925. A weapon powered by oxygen extracted from an unstable chemical compound, trading safety for performance, accepting danger as the price of speed. In the end, navies around the world decided that price was too high. Better to use slower, safer weapons than risk another HMS Sidon, another Kursk, another catastrophic explosion that kills the very sailors the weapons were meant to protect. The Chemist's insane explosive mix worked. It just worked a little too well, in ways nobody fully predicted, with consequences nobody could completely control. And in military systems, where predictability and control matter as much as performance, that was ultimately disqualifying. The torpedo that ran at 46 knots through the test channel at Newport on that September morning in 1943 represented the pinnacle of American chemical propulsion research. It embodied 14 years of work, millions of dollars in development, and countless hours of engineering refinement. It promised to give American submarines a weapon that could match or exceed anything the Japanese or Germans possessed. And it delivered on that promise, serving effectively for 3 decades before being quietly retired. But it also represented a technological path that ultimately led nowhere, a brilliant dead end. An engineering achievement that proved its own obsolescence by demonstrating that some solutions create problems worse than the ones they solve. Hydrogen peroxide gave torpedoes the oxygen they needed, but it gave them that oxygen in a form so volatile, so unforgiving of error, that the cure became its own disease. Thomas Caldwell, watching that test torpedo complete its run without incident, couldn't have known how the story would end. He saw success, proof that American engineers had mastered the same technology that made German Walter boats legends, vindication of 14 years of research, the promise of weapons that would help win the war. What he couldn't see was HMS Sidon burning in Portland Harbor 12 years later, or the Kursk sinking in the Barents Sea 57 years later. Or the quiet decision by navy after navy to abandon hydrogen peroxide, despite its performance advantages. Because some weapons demand too much vigilance, accept too much risk, and ultimately prove themselves too dangerous for the humans who must operate them. The insane explosive mix made torpedoes run silent at 46 knots. But insanity, even brilliant insanity, is a poor foundation for weapons that must be trusted with sailors' lives. Sometimes the most impressive technical achievement is recognizing that some problems are better left unsolved, some performance targets better left unreached, some chemical reactions better left unexploited. Hydrogen peroxide propulsion was all of those things, impressive in its capability, remarkable in its engineering, and ultimately, wisely abandoned. The weapon that revolutionized torpedo technology in 1943 became a cautionary tale by 1975. A reminder that in the complex calculus of military technology, raw performance is never the only variable that matters. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.